Dr. Penn is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at Franklin and Marshall College. His research interests and publications explore application of psychological research and theory of human rights, the interpretation of psychology and philosophy, and the relationship between culture and psychopathology. He has written numerous books and is involved with the United Nations, published many articles. One title of his book, Overcoming Violence Against Women and Girls, the International Campaign to Eradicate a Worldwide Problem. It is my pleasure to turn the time over to Professor Penn, who will then guide us through the roundtable. Thank you, Michael.
Well, this has really been an extraordinary day. Those of you who have been here have no doubt been greatly enriched. The conversation has been just extraordinary in terms of its range, in terms of its depth. There are so many different ways that we could approach this conversation, but I was thinking that with your permission, I would get us started, and then I would invite us to sort of engage in a kind of a round table. So we would be talking to one another, and we would also be talking to the audience. That would be the idea. So I wanted to just start with the last talk. And I wanted to start with the last talk because part of what it does for us is that it situates the discourse on human dignity and human rights in history. It places us together as conversants in a moment in history. And what you try to do is you try to describe this moment in history as part of a grand process that you feel has a direction, has some kind of momentum behind it. And in fact, we may be even only dimly aware of the process that we're engaged in. And you had suggested that intellectuals have to begin to contribute to this emerging understanding of the movement of history at this particular time. So I'm very interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say about that claim. And so if we could start with that broad general question, I hope you understand what the question is. I offer...
Could you repeat?
Right,
just
right.
the one sentence version.
Yeah. So what was remarkable to me about your talk was that you placed the current discourse on human dignity in a broader historical narrative, a kind of a meta-narrative of the movement of history, of the movement of humanity. And so you saw the articulation of human rights theory as not just some isolated phenomenon emerging out of the Second World War, but as part of a grander historical process. That's an important claim, and I'm interested in what each of you has to say about such a claim, and the role of the intellectual, perhaps the scholar, in advancing humanity's exploration of that kind of claim.
Well, I think historically we're at a point where we might, this will shock you, where we might be finding the limits of our commitment to talk of human rights. There is, when I think, for example, of what's going on with asylum seekers, and I hear the Australian Prime Minister say, we have a right to determine who comes to this country. And then, of course, refugee advocates saying they have a right to. Then I think that there's some, it would be much better here to talk about obligation to needs, for example, rather than competing claims to rights. I think it's somehow obvious that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be much better characterized as obligation to needs than it is to competing rights to the same territory. So I think I think this, especially with immigration, actually, if one asks what can one say about why one denies someone access to the country in which one happened to be born by luck. That's a bit better than saying we have the right to say who comes here. When someone says, look, you're here by luck, we're there by luck, maybe we start from there somewhere and start thinking about how we characterize our obligations or whatever it may be, our needs. It might be a lot more profitable, I think. And in the case, I really do think that I may be wrong, I'm not an historian, but I don't think one ought to keep pairing talk of human dignity with the historical development of talk of human rights. They didn't always come together. And in the case of the Second World War, for example, Lauterpacht, who made the big argument for human rights at the Nuremberg trials, and insisting that people be charged with crimes against humanity rather than genocide, because it was respect for the individual rights that had been violated, didn't at all talk about human dignity. But I really want to emphasize that my skepticism about this is not at all in the tone of what the hell does that mean. I mean, I do really think that talk of inalienable human dignity to which a certain kind of unconditional respect is owed is one of the great and noble movements of our history. But sometimes but what's inspiring is the heroic tone. And some people suffer the loss of what we might call ordinary visible dignity in cases of torture, for example, or sometimes because they just suffer the terrible affliction of some illness, mental illness, for example, where the idea that they're trying to capture what we want to say they have not lost, to try to capture that in an heroic idiom, I think, is to be kind of tone deaf. And that's why I emphasize so much in my talk that tone and these things really matter. And especially if we're inspired, we have to ask ourselves, what is the tone of this which inspires me? And maybe I should be a bit suspicious of it.
Well, as you might imagine from the tone of my remarks, I have a rather different perspective on this. So I also situate myself in an arc of history in a different way. And so part of the point that I'm trying to make is that human rights have always been historically constructed and not discovered or deduced in the way that has been too narrowly seen. And rather than an exhaustion of the rights narrative or claim, rather we need a broadening and a historically conscious analysis of the multiple sources and trajectories of construction of human rights, and then a pragmatic and conscious reconstruction and reiteration of rights that builds upon the successful elements and expands in the directions required by the changing social structures and conditions of power, because human rights are always constructed relative to structures of power against which they're making claims. So in an era of globalization, in an era of broadening consciousness, the process of inclusion, for example, shifts our notion of justice to a broader spectrum beyond legal justice. So I see dignity as an animating principle, but I think that rights themselves, in the sense of political claims, empowerment claims, actually, I sort of listed that, and I said that freedom is the default mode, it has to expand to equity, but the way in which I think rights are properly understood and that which can expand with history is as empowerment, rights as empowerment, vis-a-vis whatever the structures of power are.
Let me push this a little bit further and bring you, Professor Kirsten, into this discussion, because one of the things that is sometimes claimed is that the discourse on human rights and human dignity gave us new fodder with which to think about what we're doing and what we should be doing, right? So in effect, what we saw is we saw an evolution in our capacity to think about the relation between the individual and the state and the relationship between and among states. And that the contribution that someone like Immanuel Kant makes is that he gives us a more detailed, a more nuanced vocabulary with which to engage in that thinking, to engage in that discourse. So I guess what I'm saying is it's possible that humanity as a species acquires new fodder with which to think about its life on Earth, its development, its, what it is that we ought to be concerned about. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the place of Kantian thinking in this larger project that you had, that our colleague had raised here.
Yeah, thank you. As a Kantian, I'm very, very concerned with talk about human rights being constructed. When an Aztec warrior tortured a prisoner, I want to say the warrior violated that prisoner's human rights. But at that time, there were no rights that had been constructed. Now, it may be the case that the warrior was not to blame because he didn't have a path of reflection open to him that would have led him to do otherwise. Nevertheless, he violated that prisoner's human rights. And when we think about rights just being constructed to solve problems in certain societies, I don't think we allow ourselves to say that. I think a Kantian framework, if it in the end works, would allow us to say that the warrior was acting wrongly in torturing the prisoner.
Yes, you may. Absolutely.
Amend. So when I say that human rights are constructed, that does not mean that they are a simple result of the consensus of any given society or certainly the dominant norms of any given society at any moment. And in fact, there's an explicitly historical process of expanding human rights. So my claim was rather that in every society at every time someone has had rights, and that there has been an arc over history of increasing the scope of inclusion, the scope of rights, and the mechanisms and institutions available for claiming those. So while not perfectly teleological, there is a progressive unfolding, just as in other domains of human knowledge and action. It is historically situated, but it is not a consensus. It's not majoritarian, and I would certainly object to any kind of majoritarian consensus. That's why, for example, democracy and human rights are not equivalent, and majoritarianism can often lead to the oppression of minorities, and why we have constitutions as an increasing feature. That's an institutional embodiment of the increasing construction of rights as institutionalized features of our lives.
So Professor Sultan,
Yes.
one of the things that one hears commonly these days in human rights communities is that really the people are largely left out of the discourse on human rights. That it's a discourse among and between states that's human rights lawyers, human rights theorists, human rights philosophers, but that the people are relatively dormant in the discourse. But as I was hearing your talk, I was thinking it's a kind of talk that even the people, broadly speaking, might have a real interest in. It's a way of talking about the movement of human rights that captures a kind of energy or a kind of vision that, and I'm wondering whether that's intentional in your approach to human rights. What are you up to? What's going on?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, I could give a long answer. The short answer is yes. It's not an accident that I talk this way. The context is that my view is on an entirely different front, a cultural front. There potential for cultural reorganization that would be part of the second stage of modernity that would include development of new disciplines, cross-cutting existing disciplines. One of those is one I'm really engaged in, and that is, we call it civic studies. I think that's a lame term. I prefer new civics, but to develop the civic perspective, to develop ideas that are helpful for citizens understood as co-creators of their worlds. Okay, so not other from that, so I could skip the word citizen, helpful to co-create. So I am trying to develop, in the larger context for me, is this conception of justice, a civic conception of justice, part of this effort to develop a civic perspective. And in terms of just development of intellectual community, it is cutting across existing disciplines. And I think one of the way that modern culture has suffered is the silos effect of disciplines. This would counteract it, but more importantly, it would explicitly connect theory to practice. It would explicitly incorporate as a legitimate and crucial part of the task of developing ideas helpful to citizens, the developing of values, the discovery of values, of conceptions of justice. That's my version. Others would, there's a whole effort to bring in this civic studies initiative with the capabilities approach in development ethics. There are connections there, but so that's a long answer. The short answer to your question is yes, that is intended. If the goal is to help make the world better, which is a civic goal, then it matters that the conceptions we use are inspiring conceptions, as well as action guiding. If we don't inspire, we don't get anywhere. If we don't guide actions, we don't get anywhere.
But it matters that we understand what inspires us. As far as I know, at least in the Western intellectual tradition, there are two elaborations of this. One is the Catholic natural law tradition, and the other is the Kantian tradition. Supposing you reject, well, first of all, most people who are inspired have no idea of how these would be elaborated. If you feel that these are not adequate accounts, if you feel that, and mostly now it's Kant, that's not that gives the tone to the heroic tone to the rhetoric. If you're not as impressed as Kant was by the respect owed to rational agency, or if you think the kind of elaborations Kantians give will lead you nowhere, right? Then if you're someone like that, you have a real problem. Because you think that here is this incredibly inspiring thing that finds itself in the preambles to the declarations, which I take it is supposed to mean it's the notion of dignity that will explain to us in some way, reveal to us the deep ethical meaning of what it is to violate those.
But you know why I find this comment from you a little strange, is because when you were giving your talk, you were appealing to the extraordinary power of the arts to awaken in the human heart a consciousness of what precisely has been violated when people's rights are violated. I mean, if you take somebody like Lynn Hunt,
Empathy.
her work
Sorry.
on inventing human rights, she basically argues that with the invention of the novel, we suddenly entered lives that we had been excluded from. And so it seems to me that the power to awaken the heart's consciousness to what it means for a person to have suffered torture in a kind of a phenomenological way, not just describing in some abstract.
No, but that was my whole point about
That's
what
exactly-
I call the realm of meaning.
That's exactly what
But that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that you just accept any concept that moves you. Right? I mean, my whole point about the realm of meaning is that you have to be. There's a very rigorous critical vocabulary. It's not just are you factually mistaken. It's not just have you made the right inference from this proposition to that proposition. It's look at what moves you. Look at what moves you and see whether you're given to pathos. Right? Like let's given to sentimentality. Or maybe you're deaf to the times when the heroic register is even obscene. Right? Now, I'm not saying that that's right. I think it's right, but of course that's a matter for argument. But I'm saying it's very, very dangerous to make something so central, so inspiring, when the intellectual elaborations we have of it are so highly disputable, for the most part, not at all in the public arena, in relatively ordinary, sophisticated discourse. It's like as though we're sleepwalking. Inspired sleepwalkers, energized sleepwalkers, but sleepwalkers nonetheless.
If I may, I think that if I can pick up, it's not just sentimentality. Empathy and altruism are psychological phenomenon. They're neurological phenomenon. There is neuropsychological work that shows mirroring neurons fire when we read stories about people. There are situated sociological studies of Holocaust rescuers, for example. I don't know if you know Kristen Monroe's work on other identification. There's a new study I was just reading.
I can just, if phones are up, I don't disagree with any of that.
Okay, all right.
I'm not saying empathy is sentimental. Some expressions of empathy are, right? But empathy is the point I made in my paper. Empathy, if you're to see things as other people see them, to understand their suffering as they experience, you have to understand the concept under which they see the world or experience their suffering. And in fact, the point I think you would want to make is that if you want to understand the suffering of someone who's being tortured empathetically, one of the things you have to understand is that he experiences himself as having his dignity with a big D, violated. Empathy won't take you to the concept of violation. Empathy in this case depends on your having it. So that's the limits of empathy. But I wouldn't for a minute want to say that empathy is of itself.
But recognition does depend upon a construction of someone as a fellow human or as experiencing some parallel form of suffering. And so, for example, another recent study of Holocaust-era behavior that specifically contrasts villages in Belgium and the Netherlands, and the religious composition shows that it's not the ideology of, let's say, being Catholic or Protestant or secular that moves people to solidarity. It's whether you are a religious minority within your own community and therefore identify with persecuted Jews as a religious minority. And people risk their lives on this basis.
Why do you think I would disagree with that?
Okay, but
I'm
this
not
is
sure what you
different
think. I
than,
think that I
well,
would
it's
disagree.
different than,
No, but I don't think there can be no doubt that without the development of the person, of personhood, we do not bring to situations the sensibilities that are required in order for us to respond appropriately to violations of human rights. In other words, the protection of human rights clearly requires development of humanity. It's not simply, it can't be carried out under any context of development and under any context of. Let's open the discussion and please join us, sir.
My name is Feiyun.
Should we have a microphone just so that we can pick up?
I think first I would like to express my thanks to all speakers and the moderator. Really, you add a broad area to my knowledge about human rights, and this was really a great day for me, and I'm sure for all participants that are. Second, you were looking for a word for, when you gave the example of EU, European Union, you're looking for a word to replace the revolution. I think the word evolution of humanity can replace the word of revolution, because we are moving an evolution of human mind toward recognizing the right of all human beings in the world. And the other thing was my thought about, probably I have it in my other page. When we were talking about the human, I would like to know when and how the human being will be free from extreme nationalism and respect, understand and respect for globalization and human being as the same, regardless of race, color, and in the entire world. I know it won't be in my life, but do you have some idea when we can reach to that humanity?
December 15th, 2100.
And
He
how?
hasn't spoken much.
Yeah.
So can I, since I started, I'm sorry, no, I couldn't resist. A quick response to the idea of evolution. The event type we're talking about is distinctive because of the speed and depth of social change, right? So evolution is any kind of social change, or can be. So what we need is a word like revolution in the violent case that includes this depth and speed of transformation, which in the case of some of these events is really remarkable. I mean, when communism collapsed, you do not just have political transformation, you have complete economic transformation, all very quickly and non-violently. That is the kind of event that we're looking for a word to describe. On the other thing, so I'm sorry, I'm going to quickly, you know, it's a battle. And in battles, you win, you lose, you try to develop ideas to help you, because, among other things, ideas are sources of power resources. So you develop those. It's not that you anticipate certain wars to be won, but you know, at the moment the situation is a setback. I mean, this more global project is definitely being challenged. So what we should be thinking about how to reformulate it to strengthen it, but not anticipating the inevitable triumph of the good cause. There is no inevitable triumph of a good cause.
Can I say that just as it's not a solution to racism to suggest everybody should be white, for example, or this colour or that colour, I don't think in anything like the foreseeable future it's a solution to aggressive nationalism, paranoid nationalism, for an intelligentsia to condescend to the attachments people have, often to what they call country. Those attachments are often very dangerous, I agree. But since I think they're not going to go away, it's a really urgent responsibility to try to take the poison out of them. I mean, the EU is being one thing, but the EU will still have a foreign policy and still have military connections and so on. And so I'm not saying the nation state is the best way in which people's love of country should be expressed, but at the moment that's how it seems to be. And anybody who's been occupied will know what it's like, no longer speak your own language, no longer, and so on. So I think the universality that we hope for, that sometimes was expressed in the desire for a world government or something like that, is best achieved in a community of nations. But the trouble is how to take the poison out of the nationalism that destroys that sense of communality and a sense of, in that sense, a political realization of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth. But to be appalled by nationalism, as I think one should be, because it's been so murderous and makes good people defend the indefensible and all that. To say they're all jingoes, we better look for something else, I think in the foreseeable future will lead to disaster, because the jingoes will win if we don't take the poison.
Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I found it very striking, Dr. Gaeta. You also made this point in your talk that we need to take seriously, and in fact we don't take seriously enough, the question of love of country and how to live with it, how to even foster it without a fear, or without it in fact unraveling into jingoism. And I think it has something to do also with the point that was made later about the loss of universalism. Since the 20th century, it's sort of the flip side of that is that we haven't reconciled this need for roots, this love of country with this, the forces of universalism that attract us. And since you've asked the question a couple of times, I'm curious if you have an answer to that, or if you have some reflections on what those conditions are, in fact, under which we can have a love of country without shame and without a descent into jingoism.
Well, I think one thing is to try to keep pressing the need for international law, and to try to keep making it intelligible to one's fellow citizens that yes, maybe our Prime Minister, it's not just the ones from Latin America or someone, or Africa, that might be into an international criminal court. Maybe we should have been because of Iraq and so on. And to keep just pressing on the importance of that. But it's also important, I think, always, and this is a thought of Simone Weil's, not constantly to be glorifying the grandeur in one's country, but often to focus on those delicate things that are themselves worthy of love, not just pride. And that's the thing about nationalists, of the jingoistic sort. They're always talking about their pride in their country, but they'll never, and in ways that just hard to understand, won't accept that if you can be proud, then sometimes maybe you should be ashamed. They say if you're ashamed, you're wearing black armbands or God knows what. But to try to emphasize a kind of love of what is fragile and fine, and not just heroic. And this is why I'm resisting always that heroic thing. May I say, if I could explain why this is, the time I first heard the expression inalienable dignity was when I was 16 going on 17, and I was working in a mental hospital. And in that mental hospital, in the ward that I was in, I was there for 3 months for the summer vacation, There are people who've been there for 20, 30 years, drugged up terribly, treated brutally. For example, when they soiled themselves, as they often did, they'd just be grabbed, pushed at the end of a mop into a shower, their clothes forced off them, and when not even fully unclothed, mopped down like you wash elephants in a zoo. It was real terrible brutality. In that hospital, there are about 4 or 5 psychiatrists. The nursing staff treated them brutally, and most of the psychiatric staff did too. But there are about 4 or 5 psychiatrists who worked devotedly. And one of them said to me, even these people have inalienable dignity, you know. And actually, this is interesting in regard to I didn't know what he meant, but I was inspired by it. And I was much moved by it. And I admired them terribly for their courage to put up with the mocking that they got from their colleagues, the hard work, the compassion. And one day a nun came into the ward, and I'm not religious, so I'm just telling a story, right? A nun came into the ward, and she, there was nothing striking about her at all, but at a certain point I noticed her talking and moving amongst the patients. And I was wonderstruck. And what struck me was that she responded to them without a trace of condescension. And suddenly I realized that even these very fine psychiatrists hadn't had, as I did too. And what struck me as wondrous was not her virtues. In the case of the psychiatrist, I admired them, their virtues. In the case of her, she sort of dropped out of the picture. And I was just struck how wondrous it is that this could be true. The people who had lost everything that gives meaning to most of our lives could be treated as fully one's equal. But if you ask me what fully one's equal means, the only thing I can say is you responded rightly without condescension, right? And so, when I've reflected on this most of my life, actually, and I feel that to say that she responded to the inalienable dignity of even those patients is precisely to strike the heroic key when it shouldn't be done. And I've been struggling ever since I've been thinking of trying to find a way, if you're not religious. But you see, if someone says, oh, it's easy to explain how she did it, she believed they were children of God and so on, so there's no difficulty in the explanation. The difficulty is only how come she managed to enact her beliefs like that. I'd say that relieves no mystery, because we need an explanation of how it ever came into human consciousness that we could treat people who had lost everything like that without a trace of condescension. Why not treat them? Why, like, with loving kindness, but with that little condescension? There was a social worker who worked, an occupational therapist who worked there. And she was a really kind woman, a woman of a warm, kind heart. But when the patients came in, she'd say, that's very good, Joe, you did made 10 pegs this day, and only 5 last week. And there was that inevitable condescension. And I think if she wouldn't, I think she would think, and I think she would be right to think, how else can you respond to people who've lost everything except with a kind and loving condescension? How could it ever come into the world the thought that it should be different from that? So I think referring to her religious beliefs means nothing here. But anyway, would not provide an explanation, because, as I say, it needs an explanation as to why God should ever have given us the idea that we should love his children, all his children, like that. And the same with terrible evildoers. It's how wondrous it is that we ever got the idea. This is the other example that has constantly inspired me, although here dignity might be the natural turn is when the Adolf Eichmann trial was turning into a circus because it was a show trial. And the presiding judge, Landau, who was trained in a Germanic tradition of jurisprudence, said this has only the trial has one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to do justice. And he meant justice, of course, to the victims, and we have to follow proper procedure, but justice for Eichmann for his sake as a human being. Later, he did actually go on to talk about dignity because of that German tradition in which he was trained. But one might have just said, well, recognition for him as a human being. And it's not clear what the addition of it, because of his natural dignity, adds to that. Sorry.
Yeah, one of the most striking things that I found in our discussion earlier was the notion that Saddam Hussein was owed a fair trial for his sake, and not just in the interest of protecting the integrity of the judicial system.
Yes, when they dragged him out of his foxhole, I said to my wife, if he's tried, I bet you he won't find his Moshe Landau. You know, they'll make a show trial of this, and it doesn't matter. But this could be put in terms of using him as a means to ends too, because that was. I mean, Eichmann was a means. Trying Eichmann was for Ben-Gurion a means to teaching the world a lesson about the Holocaust and about the fact that Jews can finally try their own and don't need other people to do.
I'd like to float a kind of partial response to some of what you said. I'm struck in your story about the mental hospital in not just the dignity, but the recognition, the empathy, but again, it's not just sentimental sort of, arousal of sentiment and pathos, it's rather pathos that leads to identification with, recognition of the common human quality, some common human quality. And again, sociologically, I know that this is part of what inspires people beyond any abstract concept of dignity or argumentation. And in terms of the requisites of justice for horrific perpetrators, which I've witnessed in a number of settings of transitional justice in Latin America, for example, I think the key there is that you are recognizing the agency of the perpetrator, that it's important for the notion of justice. You can't have justice against someone who is an unwitting or a structural or who is a beast, who is not human perpetrator. So insisting on justice for the perpetrator is not just recognizing their dignity, it's recognizing their agency, and it's making the moral equation of justice work, because you need a conscious agent on both sides.
That's right, yeah. I don't know if you have any, or you moved to share any thoughts?
Well, I don't have a story as moving as Professor Gate is. Thank you for that. I mean, I would like to try to defend Kantianism a little bit. I mean, there's this notion that you suggested that it's just too abstract and doesn't really apply to the concrete world. I disagree. I can give you an example from the news yesterday. Facebook used data from 50 million users. I can say, just based on what I put on this screen today, that executives at Facebook treated members of the organization, people who participate in it, merely as means, and thereby failed to respect their dignity as persons. How? Well, because they didn't give these people an opportunity to prevent the usage of them simply by dissenting. And it was reasonable for them to believe that these people couldn't share the ends that the executives were pursuing. So that's just, it's very concrete. It's not that hard to explain. It's not very abstract.
What's abstract? I mean, don't treat me as a means, or don't treat it merely as a means to your ends, is a Kantian phrase that has entered ordinary discourse and has been rather like talk of dignity. It's been a great success. Most people, of course, don't think they need to fill it out by saying, and you know why? Or do you know what reveals what's really going on morally when this happens? Is because you're an end in itself.
No, I actually disagree with that. I think people, if you ask people, well, what exactly was wrong about what Facebook did? They're puzzled. There is no quick response to that. And what thinking along these Kantian lines can do is provide such a response.
Yeah, they used me. But that might be enough.
No, but it's, I mean, I think part of what we do as engaged intellectuals is actually explain things like what it means just to use someone. We take concepts that people use in their everyday lives and we try to make them more rigorous.
Yeah, but we don't do it. Let's put it this way. In the Kantian case, there has to be a kind of respect for nature. I mean, the Kantian thing is very controversial. He places persons over human beings. I mean, it's a person, the concept of a person, or rational agent, in fact, more abstract, that does all the ethical work when we talk about a common humanity or treat someone like a human being. That's all highly contentious. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that we should not go in for these contentious things. That's what it is to think. But part of what it is to think is sometimes to ask, well, what work do they really do? What do you add? And that, I mean, that's certainly when one says, don't treat him like that. He's a human being. Human being doesn't add anything, really. It's a way of reminding someone that it's part of our idea of a human being, that you don't do that. I knew someone who was refused a burial by a Catholic priest because he'd committed suicide. In fact, there's a story in my book, Romans. My father went to an Anglican priest. I'm not making a point about the denominations here. And said, will you bury this man, though he committed suicide? And the priest said, Anglican priest said, yes, of course, he's a human being and not a dog. Now, this was not an ethnographic observation. What he was saying was part of my idea of a human being, that even if you kill yourself, you're owed a burial. Yet it can appear to us that the because is actually offering an explanation.
Since this part of the conversation seems to me aiming to put Sam under some pressure, I thought I'd contribute to that. No, that's right. No, so I want to go back to the question I asked, but expand it, right? So I asked about poverty, but there is a larger issue, and the larger issue is the degree of connection between the Kantian ethic here and the broader conception of human rights with the list and all that. So you gave a good answer to the poverty question, but in a way not a kind of sustained answer. And I just wondered more broadly what you see as the connection between the project of human rights and Kantian ethics.
That's a perfectly fair question. Look, I'm in the midst of constructing an account, and what I have is just partial. And I value precision and clarity, so I'll go slowly and try to build something. At the moment, I think that the account I give could, for example, plausibly yield a human right not to be tortured. I think it can yield, as we talked about in our exchange, a right to basic necessities. Now, that's not everything, it's far from it, but it's a start. And also, I haven't claimed, I'm pretty careful about what I claim, and I haven't claimed that anything like the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights could be derived from a Kantian notion of the dignity of persons. I think the notion of dignity is vague, and I'm trying to make it more precise.
May I thank you all for widely differing presentations, a lot to think over and reflect upon in the coming days and weeks. It's been a long time since I've been in such a scholarly atmosphere, and maybe I have oversimplified things, but I'm wondering if this concept of human rights and of human dignity also revolves around or includes the right of self-determination. And talking about poverty and wealth, power and powerlessness, these are, I think, historically deeply entrenched in the human experience. You think of the need for a tribal leader and to pay tribute and so forth. And are we at a point where we are beginning to question, excuse me, the validity of this kind of structure and hierarchy? Are we peeling back layers, I mean, eons, of human habit to try and construct something which is different, where the power is actually based in each human being? And it is through the cooperation of empowered human beings that we may be able to construct something which is more universal and will dispense with the costly expense of war and holding up hierarchy. And maybe you can fill in some more of the blanks for me, but do you have any comments on that kind of a perspective, that we're kind of on the precipice of changing the entire structure of human society?
I guess I'm a little surprised you say we're just now at this prep, because really, to the extent one can detect this tendency, that a project which...
I think it's been building for a long time.
Exactly.
I think we're at a critical point.
Exactly. So, but there have been critical points in the past, and so that very much sort of resonates with this idea that I presented of a second stage of project of modernity, which requires the crisis. It is a response to the crisis of 20th century, but it's continuous with, that project we associate with Enlightenment, which also fits. But people talk about the Enlightenment associated with Plato and Aristotle, and that's just the Greek version, and then people talk about the axial age as having elements of that. So it's a really long-term process. So again, I respond to what you said positively, except that I would have thought the starting point was in the axial age, right? So a bit earlier.
Yeah. Well, that's clearly resonates with my view of the progressive construction. And by the way, I was thinking again about, pinning down construction, because I think it's really important. So in the documents, they talk about the progressive realization of rights. That is part of the doctrine, that it is evolutionary in that way. So we have the philosophical, and then we have the revolutions of self-determination, the French, American, etc. revolutions. We have the more recent construction of indigenous people's rights, and what I was trying to respond to this morning about kind of bridges toward collective rights, which are precisely new dimensions of collective self-determination. And there was, by the way, a previous attempt in the interwar period to do that for religious and ethnic minorities that was then sort of abandoned and resurfaces in different ways. We have, I think, potentially a very useful response to nationalism as creating alternative and balanced locuses of self-determination through human rights cities, through the EU, through, that the more variety of venues we have for self-determination, the more progressive and humanistic forms of nationalism, I think, can flourish. And last but not least, in terms, the final frontier here is 50% of humans who have not been seen as self-determined in very significant ways. And the turn through a progressive and cyclical movement away from patriarchy, which is which is a long-standing but historically variable system of social organization that's also related to political economy and state formations and other things. And so really digging into social structures and creating self-determination for not just gender relations and women's status within existing structures, but the political economy of reproduction is kind of the final frontier of self-determination. So that I think it's a great concept. Does a lot of work for us.
We'll take maybe 2 more questions.
On the theme of whether the idea of human dignity does work, it may be good to circle back briefly to the German Constitution and Article 1 of the German Constitution, which I always read as having an important subtext. And the subtext is, this Constitution is imperfect. This Constitution doesn't work. The German Constitution is full of rights, rights of co-determination at the workplace, rights on the need to share property, rights on education, some harmonious or even identical to the 6 that Professor Zoltan mentioned. And yet, at the outset, the German Constitution wants to remind everybody that notwithstanding an elaborated and carefully crafted constitution, okay, democratic institutions are capable of immense cruelty and brutality, and it happened. And so, at the outset, as the Shema, as the initial statement, it says human dignity is inviolable, and it's a way of saying this Constitution is inadequate. And in that sense, Professor Gaeta, I would say it really is doing some work, because it's an injunction. It enjoins every jurist, it enjoins every legislator to look at the decisions that are made and look at them juridically in terms of the Constitution, and then say, it's not enough. I got to go back to the Shema. I got to go back to the initial statement and say, have we really been complete? Have we looked at everything? And that's why I think maybe it does work.
Well, that was effectively your test too, but well, we just have to see what's actually going on when someone says, when someone goes back. Well, in fact, you're talking about actual legal procedures, aren't you? Yeah, and
So
we'd have to look at the
in the case
details
of German constitutional law, it does work, right? It does a lot of work. So I was a little, the way you put it, that the Article 1 says the rest of the Constitution doesn't work. Well, Article 1 emerges really from the beginning, but certainly through the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court, emerges as the key element. So the Constitution works through the human dignity provision. But that, so that's a kind of, maybe from your point of view, a too narrow an example, because it's just German constitutional law. But on the other hand, I think there are some arguments to be made that this isn't just a random example. That's an important.
That's true, but I'm hardly the only person around who doubts that the concept of dignity does much work. I mean, ethical work. So I don't want to appear to be, as it were, a lone skeptical voice here. The difference between me and a lot of people who are skeptical is I think there is something very, very important that it's trying to capture. And we mustn't ever lose that. And I'm afraid that we might lose it as we become more and more skeptical about what it actually means. I think there are all sorts of, there are all sorts of things going on in the world that make some of it, the places where I wanted to really hold. I dread the world in which somebody says, Landau was a fool. We understand we have to keep the integrity of the procedures, and otherwise God knows where we'll end up. But try to suggest that Eichmann, unrepentant throughout, someone made a film of the thing and kept the camera on Eichmann every minute of the trial. And he was told not to. He lost his job. This was, I can't remember, Israeli television or something, because he wouldn't move off Eichmann. I wanted to go around. He said, I want to see if there's ever a moment at which he shows the slightest sign of an understanding of what he's done. And he said there wasn't. So I think it's natural to say that it wouldn't have mattered morally if they'd shot him in the streets of Buenos Aires. But of course, there are practical reasons, etc., why we shouldn't do it. So I dread the world in which we lose a sense that it was for his sake. I think we're losing it. And what worries me is that if we fall back on a notion that I think in the end we can't defend, then we really will lose it all. And the same with, it wasn't empathy. In the case of the mental patients, the woman in the occupational therapy had empathy. I wouldn't have struck me as wondrous. I wouldn't have, in my whole life, I'm 72 now, I could count on the fingers of one hand people who were capable of responding as she did. The interesting question is, what's the difficulty, as it were? And it's nothing like being a great hero like Achilles. Someone might wonder at great heroism and wonder whether they could do it or whether they couldn't do it, and say, I've only known 5 people. But she wasn't on her far end a superwoman of compassion and empathy. It was on a different plane. And that's why she dropped out of the picture, whereas her psychiatrists stayed in because of their virtues, and I admired them enormously. So please don't take me as the wrong kind of skeptic.
No, you're entirely the right kind of skeptic. There's a kind of puzzle for me in that, and I'll put it in terms of disciplines, although that's a kind of stupid way to put it, but among philosophers I encounter a great amount of skepticism about this extended notion of human dignity. So there is the Kantian notion, that's okay, but this extended notion, the notion that inspires tears, there's your reaction, although yours is the right skepticism and others have the wrong skepticism, but it's very common. It's puzzling for me because it seems so important.
Can I say something about that? In actually, your book, A Common Humanity, thinking about love and truth and justice, something of that sort. That book to my mind, is the elaborate response to the claim of skepticism. That book, my read of the book, is that it embodies a profound testament to humanity's capacity to respond with all of our faculties to the human condition. And so I saw the book as a profoundly optimistic discourse. I didn't see the pessimism or the skepticism.
I'm sorry, I'm not being pessimistic. But I suspect, I'm not sure about this, but I suspect it's a book in which the word rights does not appear once. Even though it discusses all sorts of injustices, discusses genocide, discusses the Holocaust, it discusses all sorts of usual topics. That doesn't prove that the concept isn't being appealed to somehow or other. But I suspect it's right that the word rights doesn't appear once in a 300-page book.
Just one other, so one difference in approach here, and you kind of reminded me of that as well. It's in the sort of, suppose we all appreciate, embrace in some sense the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But we can do so at many different levels, and some may not do so. So I'm fine, for example, part of my kind of initial puzzle is that I take human dignity seriously because I'm loyal to this project. You know, I take this as part of my project, so I'm trying to adjust my basics, so to speak, so that I don't come up with them on my own, or I don't have this notion of human reason that I happen to have in my head that gives me access to it. I have it there. So you invoked that phrase from Universal Declaration. I invoke those phrases as starting points. And I think among philosophers, that's rare, that you have this kind of loyalty to an element of, again, I will invoke the term public political culture. But part of that, interestingly, and this is a bit of a response, critical possibly to your constructivism, the word recognition also appears. And it appears in the 1789 Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in France, but in the Universal Declaration, so it's the recognition of human rights. Whoops, you know, we're recognizing them, we're not creating them, we're not constructing them. Somehow, they were out there somewhere and we just have to recognize. So that I also want to incorporate as a kind of starting point for my thinking, but that's another topic.
What you point out is very interesting because I realize that I've been using recognition in two different ways. I've been using, there's recognition of rights and then there's recognition of persons. And I think that recognition of persons is incredibly important. And I'm not sure, recognition of rights can mean discovery. It can mean enunciation or, you know, declaration. We recognize this, we declare it to be true or a valid principle or something.
Notice how you were forced to say true.
Yes.
Which is not.
No,
yeah.
I don't want to. No,
Right,
I'm saying recognizing persons is a socio-psychological, cultural process. Recognition of rights can be ethical, legal, moral, political, right? Reaffirming, linking your recognition to some other more valid form of authority or institution. So I think those different facets of recognition may be part of our struggle. I don't want to say problem, struggle. But my point about, I think the most ethical implication of my constructivism is that human rights is a project and a struggle that we are morally obligated to engage in. When I say rights are not the answer, rights are the question, but this is a morally enjoined set of questions. We must, in every age, in every social system, ask who's included, and if not, why not? Who's responsible? And if we've said something is right or required, where is the agent that's going to make that happen? So I think there is an actual moral and ethical power in being required to ask those questions.
I do think, though, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was making an ontological claim and asking whether we agree with this claim. And the answer was yes. And I don't think it was simply a matter of having written sentences that people agreed to. I think that those sentences referred to a condition that people were agreeing to. And the sentences captured well the condition that they were agreeing to. That's my sense.
I don't want to be pedantic, but in those questions you didn't use the word right. Who's included in humanity was one of your ways of formulating. Who's responsible? And I can agree with all those things and still ask. It's not clear to me that we get at the deepest levels of the nature of our responsibility, or at the deepest levels of what it is to see someone as another human being, fully as another, and so on. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use the word rights. The point I was making is that it has to be embedded in something that has more capacity for disclosure of what is really ethically at issue. And justice is one of the
I
big...
agree.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to break this off, but we promised we'd finish by 5. I wanted to really take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you up here for such a wonderful, rich day of learning and going deeper into a very, I think, important area, especially given the condition of the world today. And I'm hoping that we get a volume out of this, from this starting point. Of course, there'll be others that'll contribute. But to thank you on behalf of the Baha'i Chair, we'd like to just give you a little small token of our appreciation. And also, I would like to thank the audience for your participation and for your being here today. I think that there's much for us to think about, much to think about in the days ahead. And hopefully we'll be able to enrich knowledge on this topic. Those of you who are doing work in your classes and doing research, etc., that you will take some of the ideas here and develop them and further spread them. Anyway, we thank you again for all of the beautiful practice. Thank you so much.